Welcome back to you all. Thanks for coming back. I'll begin by introducing Bob McIntosh. Bob has extensive experience in public policy, particularly land management and forestry. He's the Tenant Farming Commissioner, so please use this opportunity to ask questions about the role of agriculture and agricultural land in unlocking potential growth in Scotland. I will now open the floor to questions. We only have until 1 p.m, and I think you will already guess I'm going to be strict on timing. And I would like to cover as many questions as possible in the time we have. So I will not pass each question that's asked to every panel member. It will be strictly one answer for one question, and it will be strictly one question per audience member. So if your question, please tell me who you are, what you would like to ask, and if you would like to ask a particular panel member, please make it known so I can direct it correctly. There are 2 microphones, so please raise your hand if you have a question and we'll bring you a microphone. I'll start with you.
Thank you. It's John Digney, Scottish Land Revenue Group. We heard quite a bit from the speakers about the problems of derelict land and the concentration of land. And then we heard from Shona this figure that 51% of the UK worth is in land, and yet it is taxed very lightly. Hamish talked about tax and fiscal issues, and Steve talked about recycling value into the economy. Surely the key element here, the key factor, is to introduce land value taxation as an alternative rather than an additional source of revenue, enabling the Scottish Government to maximise use of its tax powers and start to reduce the burden of income tax and other destructive taxes on the economy.
Thank you. I'm going to push you a wee bit and ask what the question is.
The question is, what do the panel think about that? I don't mind who answers.
Okay. Shona, possibly? Or Hamish?
Yeah, absolutely. Tax has to be part of the solution here. And I think I indicated, is that working? So absolutely, tax has to be part of the solution here. And I indicate that in the presentation. I think you're right. Land is lightly taxed.
They should be turned on automatically.
Right, is that better? Right, I'll try shouting. Absolutely, land has to be part, taxation has to be part of the story here. Land is very lightly taxed, as I indicated in my presentation, and that's something we need to change. But I think, as Rosanna said earlier, it's not just as simple as as introducing one tax. That's not going to work. There's a whole load of different ways we can do that, and a whole load of different things that we need to look at to make sure it works. And that's the kind of thinking we're in the process of doing. Okay. Oh, that's better. So yeah, we're in the process of doing that thinking, and please be rest assured. But I'm sure you can appreciate that it's vital that we get this right, because if we get it wrong, what we could actually do is end up making the problem worse.
Thank you. There's a gentleman at the back.
Malcolm Fraser, architect. Probably for Shona again. We all know the need to be bold. I'm sure we're all a bit disappointed at CSOs being held back, because there's a big lever. Equally, can we please have a plea to be bolder on land value capture or land value sharing, or whatever you want to call it? If your current advice to the government is saying that it's unfair and the very rich, which I think it is, then that doesn't tie in with the boldness that you've just put up on stage. And if it is, if the reason we're not pursuing it is the timidity of our changes in planning, can we try and push to join up? As we say, we need joined up legislation. If the Planning Act is too timid, we need a more German view of planning that allows us to capture the vast value in the land and use it for the common good, and not be too scared about challenge to landowners losing all the uplift that our public policy brings. Please.
Thanks, Malcolm. I don't think we need to be too negative about the position of government on these things. I mean, they have said very clearly that they're committed to introducing compulsory sales orders. The question is simply the matter of parliamentary time and when that comes. They've said they're committed to doing that in the next session. And I think this week's publication on the work programme for the planning bill again indicates that they are actually going to put together a package of measures on land assembly and land value capture. So I think that work, is happening. It's ongoing. Clearly, government need to decide when they feel the time is right to actually legislate on these things. But I think the important thing for us is that the thinking is developing, the proposals are moving, and it's happening. And I would just add, I think you're absolutely right to highlight the international experience, because I think what our work on this has shown so far is actually it's not about a single policy intervention. A simple change on existing use value, for example, is not actually going to deliver what we all want it to. This is a much bigger part of a much bigger picture about a really proactive approach across the public sector as a whole to planning and placemaking, and actually sharing the risks and rewards and investing what we need to happen.
Thanks, Hamish. There's a gentleman just in the middle on this side. A bit further forward.
Yeah, Chris Cook, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security at UCL in London.
That's a catchy title.
It is, isn't it? It is. Sorry about that. It's a mouthful. But I'm based in Scotland, Rob. Something that is the great unspoken, really, but we've touched upon it. We've touched upon the taxation side, and Malcolm just raised the development financing side, you could say. But something that isn't actually widely understood is that actually 2/3 of our money supply, which is based on mortgages, is land-based. Our money supply is land-backed, to all intents and purposes, and that's really just not understood. And if we allow land value tax to come in, the banking system will collapse. Now, that might be a feature, not a bug for most of us here, but we do actually need to take into account that we need to address the financing and funding. It's a matter of the current development model, I call it the 4 Bs, buy, borrow, build, and bugger off, okay? It's a transactional model, and we need to get to a services model. And this whole area of the legal foundations, if you like, of what we even think of as property, the rights of use, the fruits of use and management, I think we need a fundamental reappraisal of what land actually is, okay? And this is what I'm working on at UCL. So my question is, what work is the Scottish Land Commission doing on the financial pornography of how we fund land?
I'm going to put that to Hamish. I'm not going to repeat the question.
Thank you. So I think, you have raised the key thing there is that this is actually about systemic change, I think, and that is what our work is about. So we are starting to unpick the bits of the system in this. So we have been looking at land value capture, and we've looked at previous experience on that. We have looked at international experience of land value tax, and actually what that tells us is that it is very complex and it's very easy to get it wrong, and some countries have got it wrong and have changed it. So we do need to think very carefully about how that works as part of the system. And we are going on now to look at, as both Shona and I mentioned earlier, how do we actually look at the shift, to support the shift that the government set out in the housing system? How do we help make that shift in terms of bringing land forward in a much more proactive and public interest way, and not simply responding to market? The market has a huge role to play in delivering this, but we need to be really clear about what the public interest is in actually what we want to see delivered through the planning system.
Thank you. I would like to get a question on a different topic if possible, and hopefully a question for Steve or Bob. John, middle on the floor on this side. Please be as brief as possible.
I haven't even started yet. This is a question for...
It's okay, he's known me a while, I'm allowed to be cheeky.
You're allowed to be rude. This is a question for Steve. Traditionally, Scottish Enterprise has never been a big promoter of communities. And I was interested in your presentation. You mentioned communities, but they tended to be more communities of specialist interest. And you talked about place. Is place the same as communities, and will geographical residential communities be part of Scottish Enterprise interest going forward?
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a good question. I think what I was saying is that over the last 15 years, Scottish Enterprise's focus had really begun to laser in on sectors and on businesses of scale through an account management system, and that worked. Before that, though, Scottish Enterprise had a very localised and dispersed model. And the enterprise companies then were totally embedded in those local communities and those local economic plays. And therefore, their interventions were much more broad brush a long time ago compared to what they have been over the last decade or so. My feeling is that providing focus has huge value, but we missed out on participating and partnering with a much wider ecosystem of partners in place. Now, for me, what we have chosen to do is to look at the regions as the organising areas for where we believe that we can make the biggest impact. Because we have limited resources, limited people, limited capacity, therefore, again, how do we make the biggest impact? I am deeply interested in how Scottish Enterprise participates in the regional economic partnerships with it, because those are the places where the most amount of money from Westminster Government and Scottish Government is coalescing around long-term strategic plays. And that is more and more, and I think the next wave of investment in the regions will be much more focused on place. And by place, for us, it is a complex concept. Inclusive growth is a complex concept, but nevertheless, working in partnership, working in concert with the system, it will begin to look different in different places, and therefore you can't prescribe it. So in some areas, for example, we will work in urban areas in the city that will really focus on restructuring a city's economy. There will be some places in rural areas, and we have a big role to play in the rural economy, where we will really be focused at very local levels. And therefore, it can't be one size fits all. It needs to be in partnership. We need to add our resources to make sure that they are aggregated up in order to make a bigger impact. But what I want to do is place Scottish Enterprise into those arrangements, to be a partner, to think about our assets as strategic assets, to consider giving away our assets when that's important, because we don't have the answers to everything. I want to be agency fluid. I want to be talent fluid, so that we don't hold on to and possess our assets or people or money or our resources, and therefore that this is absolutely a system play. And again, just to finish off, my experience over that 30 years is that the answer in Edinburgh will be a different answer in Glasgow, will be different in Dumfries, will be different in other parts of Scotland. And therefore, you have to be open to local innovation, the local determinants of what success is. And you need to be really open as an organisation and a system to be able to accommodate that. So maximum agility, maximum flexibility.
Thank you. There's a gentleman here, 3 rows from the front, blue jacket.
Hi there, Andy Milne from SURF. So we did the research for the Scottish Land Commission on the prospects for introducing higher levels of community engagement in community land ownership and use. A really welcome opportunity and a very timely piece of support from the Scottish Land Commission on the broader front of regeneration that SURF's concerned with. One of the messages that came out of that research, though, was the fact that in the poorest communities in urban areas, people are literally focused on paying the rent and feeding their children. They're working very, very hard at that, several jobs. And it seemed a stretch in many cases to move from that to ownership. They were very interested in who owns that bit of derelict land, what's the plan for it, how can we be involved. But there was the gap in aspiration to ownership because of other much more understandable priorities. So there was a point made earlier about broader economic policy. So there's the risk, I would suggest, of unintended consequences in introducing opportunities without having addressed the underlying issues of poverty and inequality. We saw some of that in the community asset transfer legislation, where, no disrespect to anybody who lives in Kilmacombe, Dunblane or Portobello, people were able to take good advantage of those opportunities. I think this is to Steve, really. What measures can we be making in addressing broader economic policy on poverty and disadvantage to really genuinely open up the prospect of ownership and higher levels of involvement in the poorest urban communities?
Yeah. I mean, I think our starting point is that we're in the jobs business, and, more better jobs. If you look at our framework, it's all about jobs and better quality jobs, fairer jobs. Because, and a job is in the Cabinet Secretary's words, the best social policy that you can provide any individual, any family, any community. So we are very, very focused on the jobs aspect. When we move into place, we are interested in what jobs can we retain, what jobs can we grow, which jobs can we begin to create as part of, as I said earlier, part of restructuring Scotland's community. And speaking over coffee there, it is clear, and Andrew and I, in fact, working previously together, for me, there are some of the hotspots where communities are totally active, and those are the ones that will soak up and very quickly, get into community ownership and take advantage of all of those things. And that's great, and that's terrific. And I think, that's good for them. I would like our resource to be able, our human resource, and our financial resource to go to build capacity in communities to be able to take that next step. So I think, for me, the economic sustainability and the vitality of a community, and therefore its capacity, then allows it then to take bigger steps into ownership and creating, futures for that community themselves. So I completely agree. If what you're saying is, here is a complex, very challenging problem. Again, and from my experience, local authorities, in my days in local authorities, we used to, exhaust ourselves in resources in trying to fix an asset, and if we couldn't, then we would give it away to the community after 20 or 30 years of trying. And for me, the issue is how can we change the system, rethink the system, and give away productive assets, not failed assets? How can you give assets that are income producing now to communities? Could we be brave enough that we could imagine, the transfer of, not of broken things, of working things, of functional things, that then creates jobs, that then creates economic viability, that then creates, potential growth. So I think I would totally agree, we should really fundamentally look at this as a system play and not an incremental change. I think we should be really brave about challenging some of the fundamentals.
Thank you. We've got a gentleman here at the front, second from the end, second row. And I hope this is a question for Bob. I'm guessing it is.
Indeed it is,
Thank you.
Sally. I thought Bob was looking a little bit sort of bored there, so I thought we'd just wake him up. I'm Angus McCall, Scottish Tenant Farmers Association. It's actually a question or a point directed to the whole Commission. Is that in forming the best use made of land and all your future strategies, it is very important to bear in mind that between 20.25% of agricultural land in Scotland is not owned. It's not used by owners. It's used by tenants. And I think in formulating policy, you want to make very sure that the policy drivers are not going to impinge upon a successful tenanted sector, bearing in mind that tenancies are fairly restricted in terms of the legislation, what they can and they can't do, and there's many aspects of climate change mitigation, planting forestry, woodland, and all the rest of it that tenants can't take advantage of. And I know that we're thinking about it at the moment, but it's important to bear this in mind in formulating future policy.
Okay, I'll ask Bob. Do you think that is a risk?
Yeah, I think, just to go back a bit, I think one of the positive aspects of agriculture is that it has, for a long time, had a system where people who don't own land can get access to that land to farm through the tenanting sector. And that's a solution which has worked pretty well over many, many years. I think it's becoming a little bit more difficult to make it work well just now. The perfect way of finding a way where people who've got land who don't want to farm and bringing them together with people who want to farm who haven't got land is a bit like the search for the Holy Grail. What we're keen to do in the Land Commission is to encourage people to think more broadly about how you bring these two parties together, using a much wider range of types of business partnership, with the conventional tenancy just being one way of making that happen. And as a bit of hobby horse of mine, but I'm not sure that 100 years of complicated agricultural holdings legislation is actually helping the tenanted sector.
Thank you. And we've got another question here, second row.
Anne Packard, my question perhaps is best directed to Hamish, if I may. You mentioned young Scott. Looking around the room, I suspect there are relatively few people in the room in the age cohort 18 to 25, which is their remit. So could you elaborate on what you have done with them and what scope there is for the development in that age group of the resilience, community determination, capacity building that will take the next generation forward, because they are going to inherit that which we leave behind?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, Hamish.
Yes, I mean, I think you're probably right about that particular age group, but looking around the room, I don't think we're doing too badly today. But so the work we've done with Young Scott was particularly focused in an urban context, and we sort of worked with Young Scott to do a bit of work on trying to bring together young people in their age bracket together to talk about actually how engaged do they feel in what's going on around them at the moment. Do they actually feel engaged in some of the big decisions about buildings, land, places where they live? And I think two things I think we took from that. One is actually that it was quite hard to get large-scale participation in that, and inevitably we got those who were already interested. And I think it also showed that actually, yes, there is a huge appetite within that age group, clearly, to be influencing the places they live in and to be playing a part in shaping that. But we're really not making it easy at the moment. So I think it's hugely important. I mean, Andy mentioned the work that SURF have been doing. Community Land Scotland have also been looking at this. I think it's hugely important that we actually pool our collective efforts now to really think through how do we make it much easier, and how do we link in with the planning system, because so much of urban land use goes through the planning system. How do we join these things up so that actually the whole spectrum of the community interest, not just young, but the whole spectrum of community interest, find it much easier to engage in thinking ahead through some of the changes that they want to see that can then go through those systems.
Do you mind if I?
Yeah, carry on.
Do you mind if I add to that? And again, going back to our British Waterways and Scottish Canals experience, when from these redundant and broken assets and places that were unproductive and unloved, and we decided that we were going to transform those. Well, it wasn't our ideas that transformed, it was communities' ideas, and we used a particular technique that's now commonplace, but charrettes, where you had this intensive focus over 4 or 5 days where people would be able to come and influence and indeed shape, and it was their ideas that became the future. And you had to be really brave because you didn't know what was coming. But the important point for me was that was young and old together. It was the grandchildren, because actually when you go to public consultation, our experience was it was people who were very clear about what they didn't want, and young people were often excluded. My experience in Partick, for example, was phenomenal, where the children began to reshape their future, their next generation. They did it in a compelling, a coherent way that began to change the balance between housing provision, green provision, industrial provision, and it was their world that prevailed. And they sorted out all the folks who were the naysayers. So it was phenomenal. So for me, we absolutely must include young people in it, but at the same time, not separate, not as a separate group, but an integrated approach to that. But those who do it, you must do it wholeheartedly. You must believe in it, and then you must go with what comes out of that. And if it's framed properly, you get the right answers. You get outstanding answers.
Thank you. Gentleman, second row, second from the end.
Thank you, Graham McCormick. We haven't really talked about local authorities, and they actually own a huge amount of the dilapidated land and property. And they've owned it for generations in many respects. And at the first Land Commission conference 2 years ago, in the main gathering, it was agreed from the floor that they were the biggest inhibitor to economic development in areas. Now, the best incentive to get these councils, whether land's in public ownership or private ownership, is to turn that land into liability. And if they have to pay an annual ground rent or a land value tax on it, they'll soon change their culture and either give the thing away or give it to others that can actually do something with it. You know, I think that's what's really important. We should really look at this, because really land value tax, annual ground rent or whatever is the key to so much. It can really transform lives. And there are too many people who are really poor in this country, and they need to be, poverty needs to be attacked, and land is the source in which we can actually attack and defeat poverty.
I don't want to get into the tax issue that's been covered, but absolutely would 100% agree with you that local authorities are absolutely key to the solution. And we talked about that this problem in vacant and derelict land has been around a long time, and it's not moving, and therefore big shift is required. That's why I'm really keen that if we talk about regional partnerships, that those regional partnerships, for me, need to be, aligned to those regional economic partnerships. Because if we begin to see land not as a problem but as an asset, and you overlay that with all that strategic economic investment that's coming into those partnerships, that's where those dots need to be joined up. So I'm really keen that there is an overlap, that local authorities play a major part in that. And if they can, and the model needs to build capability and capacity into the system, then we need to address it. But doing nothing is not available.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions. There's a lady here, middle side there.
Thank you. Mary Christie from Scottish Natural Heritage. Various speakers this morning have alluded to the value of the environment, the contribution of the environment to whether it's flood risk or improving people's environments and attracting talent or climate change, etc. And I was wondering whether people have ideas on what the barriers that might be peculiar to attracting investment in nature and in natural capital, in building a natural capital, and what the solutions might be for that, so that we address build opportunities and also address ecological crises at the same time. Thank you.
Thanks. Bob or Shona, maybe, do you want to?
Yeah. Is that on? I'm not sure how much I can say about opportunities, but I think I can probably hopefully say something useful about how we get to there and how we can start to realise those opportunities. And I think what this comes back to for me is how we assess the benefits of productive reuse. And at the moment, I think what we tend to do as a society, we tend only to look at the financial value, we tend only to look at financial returns. It's a very kind of narrow cost-benefit analysis that we tend to do. And I think what we need to move to is a situation where instead of just looking at narrow cost-benefit analysis, we're actually quantifying, measuring the wider social benefits, environmental benefits, cultural benefits that bringing assets back into use can deliver. And I think if we do that, and we've got a consistent, sort of sensible, robust methodology for doing that, and that's when we're going to be able to bring that investment into those kind of projects. So we're about to start some work. We're going to be commissioning it next week, actually, to do just that. So I'm not sure that totally answered your question, but yes, I think we're on it. We know how we're going to get there.
Thank you. Well, I think we are just about out of time, and I don't want to break my own rules, so I don't think we can take any more questions just now. That brings the morning to a conclusion, and I just wanted to say a couple of things that stuck out for me. I absolutely loved Steve's comment on we need to turn this climate emergency into a climate opportunity. And Hamish mentioned about let's start talking about people, not property. And Shona has showed us that there are important economic reasons for pushing fairness. And Bob has very kindly reminded us that 100 years of legislation doesn't always help something. So I want to say a very big thank you to Steve, Hamish, Shona and Bob. I found the morning very thought-provoking and very informative. I want to say thank you to all of you who asked questions. I want to say thank you for being a well-behaved audience and being punctual. And without further ado, lunch will be served upstairs. Please use this opportunity to get to know other people, have a bit of networking, and look at the marketplace stands that we have upstairs. If you did have a question and we ran out of time, Catch one of us, any of the commissioners, or any of the panel, and we will gladly try and answer if we can, or point you to someone who will be able to answer the questions. I hope you enjoy your lunch. Please be back here punctually at 13:45 for a lively afternoon of discussions. Thank you.